Well, we finally moved on out of ADDS, GPOs, those are all behind us. You should be very familiar with those. And now we're going to move into a couple other services that integrate with Active Directory. Specifically in this lesson, we're going to talk about the installation and configuration of the Active Directory Certificate Services, or ADCS. And ADCS is very powerful because it provides the foundation for your public key infrastructure, or your PKI, which manages your digital certificates within your organization. And you need digital certificates to provide for authentication, as well as some additional security options using encryption. PKI provides three primary benefits: authentication, allowing you to identify users or computers or services; verification, ensures that your data being transmitted has not been modified in any way, shape, or manner; and it also verifies that the sender who's sending that information is who they are claiming to be. Lastly, privacy provides a way to encrypt the data, either at rest, which means on the file system, or in transit, such as an email message. In order for us to use AD Certificate Services, we have to install that, and we can use Server Manager via the add roles and features to do so. Or, of course, we can use PowerShell. We also have to configure that. So you're going to see it's a two-step process. We have to perform the installation of the services, and then we have to configure either a standalone or an enterprise CA. We're going to talk more detail about that in this sub-lesson here. We can automate the configuration of ADCS by using a capolicy.inf file, which will streamline the configuration of ADCS. If you want to install ADCS on a server core operating system, you'll have to do so using either PowerShell or using Remote Server Manager. Because remember, a server core doesn't have a GUI. Now, as we drill into the ADCS services, you're going to see it's going to be a bit of alphabet soup, so I'm going to introduce some acronyms here. CA is Certification Authority. PKI, which you should be familiar with, Public Key Infrastructure. CES is the Certificate Enrollment Web Services, which runs on your Windows 7 clients or higher, and it communicates with the ADCS to retrieve the certificates for those clients. We have a CRL, which is the Certificate Revocation List, and this is used to determine whether a certificate has expired or not. We have a CDP, a Certificate Distribution Point, and we have AIA, which is Authority Information Access. And we'll drill into these as we move through this lesson, but I want to get the alphabet soup up on the table so we have an idea as to what some of these acronyms are as we see them on the slides and when we see them in documentation. As you can see, there are several different ADCS roles and services, and the first is the Certification Authority, which is responsible for managing the issuing and revocation of certificates. And underneath that, you see that we can use the PowerShell command of install-ADCS Certification Authority. And I've provided all the PowerShell commands for the installation of these services as we introduce each service. And the next one is CES, which is the Certificate Enrollment Web Service, which allows your computers running at least Windows 7 to connect to a CA through web services. This acts as a proxy to the CEA, but it does require the ADDS force level of Windows 2008 R2 or higher. So be aware of that requirement. We also have the Certificate Enrollment Policy Web Service, which enables the retrieval of the certificate enrollment policy information. When we combine this with CES, which we just introduced, you can enable policy-based certificate enrollment if one of your retrieving computers is not a member of an ADDS domain or is just not currently connected to an ADDS domain. The Certification Authority Web Enrollment Service provides you the ability to issue and renew certificates for users, computers, and devices that are running with non-Windows operating systems, or they're not a member of an ADDS domain, or they may not happen to be connected directly to your network. So that's where you would be using that service. The Network Device Enrollment Service. This is used to allow routers and switches to obtain certificates from ADCS. And the Online Responder enables you to manage online certificate status protocol, validation, and revocation checking. And you also see the Online Certificate Status Protocol listed as OCSP as part of your alphabet soup. And remember, you can install all of these services through Server Manager as well as through PowerShell. And this is a summary of those 6 ADCS PowerShell commandlets along with an explanation of those commandlets. And now that we've installed, we need to decide if we want to create a standalone or an enterprise. The standalone can deploy without ADDS, so that's pretty sweet. Don't necessarily have to be connected to the Active Directory domain services. Can often deploy as an offline root CA, So we're off in a remote area. We want to take our CA offline for security purposes. Users will request their certificates via web enrollment. However, in this case here, the administrator must approve all the certificate requests. Let's compare that to enterprise. Requires ADDS for deployment. Cannot be deployed as an offline root CA. The CA configuration and registration information is in fact stored in ADDS, hence the reason for the requirement of ADDS. And your users can request certificates using either web enrollment, a manual process, web services, or an option called auto enrollment. The requests are automatically handled based on the configuration settings. So with the enterprise flavor, we don't need the manual certificate approval process by our administrators like we did with the standalone. When considering enterprise or standalone CA, it's primarily related to the decision whether or not you want to deploy a single or multiple tier CA architecture based on the root CA as well as the subordinate CAs. Your enterprise CA cannot have an offline, but it can have subordinates. As we can see in the blue area here, we have domain controller. We have an enterprise root CA, and we have a subordinate CA, and we also have our client. And everything is online because it's enterprise. If you do add a subordinate CA, that's the CA that's responsible for issuing and managing the certificates for your users, your computers, and your devices. But the subordinates do require a certificate from the root CA before they can manage these certificates. And on the right-hand side, outside of the blue, we have a standalone root CA. Here, we now can use an offline root CA. We can't use offline within the blue area or the enterprise environment. And we can have a subordinate CA, either under the standalone as well as underneath the offline root CA, which again means the subordinate CA will be responsible for the management of those certificates in a standalone environment as it is in an enterprise environment. And let's step out now to our Windows Server 2016 image that we've been working with all during the configuration of Active Directory directory services and the use of GPOs. We're going to go back into Server Manager through roles and features, and we're going to install and we're going to configure the Active Directory certificate services. And here we are back in Server Manager. We're going to click on this option here called Add Roles and Features. It's going to be a role-based or feature-based installation, so we're going to go ahead and leave that and click Next. Onto this one server here. We're still in the primary controller AZMTP1. So we're going to click Next on this. Right at the very top, the very first one, Active Directory Certificate Services. We're going to click on that. It's talking about remote server administration tools it's going to require along with Active Directory Certificate Services tools. We're going to leave the Include Management Tools installed. We're going to click Add Features. We'll click Next. We'll click Next again. And it's giving me information specific about ADCS. It's telling me, for instance, the name and domain settings of this computer cannot be changed after a CA has been installed. No intentions of doing that. But be sure to peruse through these before you install ADDS on a computer that's maybe a little bit more versatile with what you're going to be doing with it. We'll click Next again. Here's where I can choose what services I want to install. Here's the CA. Here's the Policy Web Service, the Web Service, the Certification Authority Web Enrollment, the Network Device Enrollment Service, and the Online Responder. So notice I can install multiple services as I'm performing the installation of Active Directory Certificate Services. I'm simply going to keep this one simple and install the CA. Click Next. If it needs to do a restart, have at it. And it's verifying that's what I want it to do. Click Yes. And then we're going to click Install. And then I'm going to pause the video so you don't have to watch the progress bar, and then we'll bring it back as soon as it completes. And you'll see we have the successful installation option, and we have an option to configure Active Directory Certificate Services on the destination server. If we come out of here and not click this link here, notice back here we have a yellow icon. That's also where I can come in and perform our next step. So we've completed step one. We've completed the installation. I'm going to go ahead and click on this option to now configure it. And it tells me to install these 3 items here. You have to be part of the local administrators group. And to install these 4 items here, we have to be in the enterprise admins group. We're good with this. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. We're going to go with just the CA as I mentioned earlier. We'll again click Next. Now it's asking if I want the enterprise CA versus the standalone CA. We've talked about the difference between the two. We only have the 2 domain controllers in this entire domain. So I'm going to roll with the enterprise CA. It's asking if I want to create a root CA versus a subordinate CA. Well, I'm going to begin by creating a root CA. Create a new private key or use an existing private key. So if you have one that you're already using, you want to be able to import that, we can do that as well. But we're going to create a new private key. And we'll use the default RSA Microsoft Software Key Storage Provider. Key length is 2048. Again, I'm going to go ahead and just leave the defaults here, and I'll click Next. Here's the common name for this CA, which is AZMTP, which is the beginning of our domain name. And then the computer name is AZMTP1. The distinguished name is DC equal AZMTP, DC equal Pearson, DC equal COM. So that's our distinguished name for this CA. And then a preview of the distinguished name is listed here as well. Leaving all this as defaults. Click Next. We're going to say the CA expiration date is going to be 5 years from now. Notice that's the default. We can change this number. We can also drop this down to days, weeks, or months. 5 years will be plenty. This image will be long gone before 5 years, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that as the default and click Next. Certificate database location is going to be in a Windows System 32 cert log, as is the log location. You want to change those up? Here's your chance to do so. We're going to go ahead and leave those as the default and click Next. And it's going to give me a summary screen of everything that's going to happen as it configures the ADCS. I'm going to go ahead and click Configure, and again, pause the video. And that was very quick. The ADCS has been successfully installed and configured. We'll go ahead and click Close to close this out. We'll close out the previous window that popped up while we performed the installation phase of this two-phase installation and configuration of ADCS. And a couple considerations for an offline root CA. I mentioned the idea you'll want to do this if you have a remote area and you're worried about securing your certificates. And the reason you have to worry about it, because if your root CA is compromised, all the certificates are also compromised. And each certificate contains CDP and AIA locations. Don't forget, your CDP was your certificate distribution point and AIA was your authority information access. Your CDP and AIA locations are configured on your root CA, but you could take your standalone CA offline to secure your PKI. Talk about alphabet soup, this is full of it. Some considerations for the offline root CA. Define a CRL CDP. Define CRL validity period, and the shorter that period is, the worse it is, because whenever that validity period ends, you need to bring that CA back online in order to renew that validity period. Define an AIA point, because by default this resides on the root CA, and if that CA is offline, then that means the AIA is also inaccessible. So you could define an alternative location and then copy the AIA information to that location. And to share that root certificate with a subordinate, you're going to need to export that root CA certificate. You're then going to want to share that certificate, so you're going to want to use group policy to publish that root CA certificate. And most often, in an enterprise CA, you're going to use a subordinate CA within that ADDS environment. Now, I mentioned creating distribution points for CRL and AIA. And this is a 5-step process. You'll configure the CRL distribution and AIA points. You're going to export the CA certificate for installation on the subordinate CAs. You're going to install the root CA on that subordinate CAs, and you're going to do this by installing it in the Trusted Root Certification Authority store. Then you'll deploy the subordinate CAs by certification purpose, by location, by business group, and you want to take into consideration load balancing and high availability. And as I mentioned, you're going to want to publish that certificate. The easiest way to do that for your entire domain is to publish it through the default domain policy. And notice the note, a lot of the enterprise root CA, like your CDP and AIA information, that's all automatically configured, maintained, and replicated through your ADDS for us. So there's not much that you need to do when you're working with an enterprise CA.